Hey everybody, what's going on? Hellmite here, bringing another video from Grab the Lantern today. Today I wanted to talk a little bit more about the incoming Void Invasion story arc that Riot seemed to be setting up to a certain extent with the introduction of Bel'Veth, and sort of give my thoughts and ideas about things that I want to see Riot take a look at, characters that they could potentially involve, and plot lines that I think are worthy of sort of inspection or interest or otherwise trying to consider. And the reason I want to do this primarily is because I think now is a very good time for it. I think that when Riot introduced Viego, they already knew that they were going to do this whole Sentinels of Light storyline, and unfortunately Riot, when they did the Sentinels of Light storyline, forgot a lot of characters and just didn't handle the event the way they should have. For example, both Callista and Hecarim are very closely tied to the events of the sort of Ruined King's storyline and could have been involved with the overall plot, but weren't for some reason. York could have had a better part in the story, and he essentially didn't do anything. Maokai's another character who shows up in Ruined King, the RPG game, but didn't actually show up in the plotline, and again is a character who's very closely tied to the whole storyline of the Ruination. And so, and in general, the way the story was told by Riot wasn't done very well. There was a lot of just things that they forgot to do or things that they didn't present in a good light, and generally speaking, I think there were a lot of missteps with the Sentinels of Light story arc. And now Riot's released a whole big long article talking about all of their learnings from this event, so I don't want to harp on it too much, but generally speaking, I think that the earlier we can start talking about potential story arcs, the better it's going to be for the overall product of whatever lore event that Riot decide they're going to be doing next. And I do feel like they're really stepping things up with this whole Void Invasion arc. Obviously, we have Bel'Veth, who actually gives a sort of name and face to the Void as the sort of person in charge, or being in charge, I guess I should say. She's not really a person, but the being in charge of the Void, who is actually sort of controlling everything and who sort of has plans for the Void as a whole. I feel like it makes a lot of sense that if she exists, that Riot are probably looking to do an actual Void story at some point. And this is especially true given all of the stories we've got recently. Hollowspun was the story with Kai'Sa and Talia. There was a story talking about the sort of stonemason artisans whose village was destroyed by the Void, which is eventually where Talia and Kai'Sa ended up. Obviously, they were both in the big cinematic at the start of the year, and then obviously there was the most recent announcement of Bel'Veth, which has sort of connected everything. And this, I think, is a really, really cool thing that Riot are doing to actually show up and say, hey, look at the sort of ongoing story arc that we've got. And we finally have an introduction to what the story of the Void actually might look like. I think for a while, there's just sort of been this vague, impending threat over Runeterra. The Void could invade at any time, but there's never been any actual evidence to suggest that. There's never been anything to consider what the breaking point would be. The Void have just sort of been an ever-present threat to Runeterra in specific areas, and there's never really been any impetus for change, right? But with Bel'Veth, and with Bel'Veth actually talking to Kai'Sa and saying specifically, here's what's up, you help me deal with the Watchers, I will give you time, but obviously if once the Watchers are dealt with, I will probably try to obliterate your race, and in the meantime, she's not really going to change that much else, right? That sort of, to me, indicates that we have a starting point for a story. We can actually have Kai'Sa go off and try to find a way to deal with the Watchers, find a way to deal with Bel'Veth, and potentially to end the threat of the Void. Maybe not once and for all. I do feel like there are other characters who would probably be better suited for that, but either way, that kind of a thing, right? We have sort of a main character and a way to set this all up. So anyways, I wanted to talk about that a little bit today, and things that Riot, I think, should consider while they're sort of evaluating this story arc and evaluating the kinds of characters that they actually want to introduce going forward. Obviously, Kai'Sa is sort of the number one character. I do feel like a major story arc that will hopefully be happening sometime this year is going to be Kai'Sa meeting Kassadin, which is not going to go well for either one of them, I have to think. But hopefully that's something that happens sooner rather than later, and we can sort of get a sense for whether or not Kassadin will be on board with Kai'Sa's plan, or if they'll sort of be at odds with each other, which would be kind of sad, but also a very interesting storyline that we could have. Obviously, Malzahar exists as well, which I would love to see Kai'Sa interact with at some point, because it's sort of his fault for why she lived for so long in the Void as well, and it would be kind of fun to have her get that reckoning with Malzahar and to sort of understand that. I don't expect the sort of Malzahar arc to be concluded. I feel like the only way they could possibly conclude that is with Malzahar getting killed by Kassadin, right, who finally gets revenge for everything he did. But that's sort of neither here nor there. At the very least, I think it would be fun to actually have those two meet in canon, Kassadin and Malzahar, that is, or to have Kai'Sa and Malzahar meet each other at some point. That would also be kind of interesting. I also think it'd be really interesting to get a little bit more thought process of Vel'Koz, as he's sort of the product of the Watchers. He's the first Voidborn that was ever created, and he was created specifically by the Watchers. So not even a sort of Voidborn that has appeared as a part of everything else that's going on. He is like a direct product of the sort of progenitor gods of the Void. So I think it would be really interesting then to see him show up as a character and what his sort of influence might be on the sort of rest of the storyline, right? I really want to see what Vel'Koz is going to be doing, if he helps or hinders Kai'Sa, right? Is he going to try and kill off Kai'Sa, and in that case, would Bel'Veth be an ally against Vel'Koz? There are some kind of interesting things that could potentially happen there. I think another interesting part that I have to comment on here is the Ascended. Now, for those of you not in the know, after the sort of disaster at Acacia, where they sort of opened a ginormous void portal, and is sort of the reason Shurima has so many void problems nowadays, the Ascended host was actually mobilized to battle against the Void. So this involves characters like Nasus and Renekton and all those kinds of characters. And they were all involved in this sort of story arc. Now, I'm unsure of the exact timing on this. I believe it could have happened immediately before Azir's fall and the sort of fall of the Shuriman Empire. It may have happened afterwards. I'm not entirely clear on that, but the Ascended were involved in this, which means that our Ascended characters may have some say in what's happening with the Void. However, this also means that Darken characters, because Darken are Ascended, could also get involved. I think there is an interesting thought process where Aatrox, for example, who is sort of this big bad guy who's trying to basically kill everything and everyone, he has a lot of voice lines that sort of say how he stood against the Void once, right? He did what he could, and instead he was reviled for it, so now he's sort of like, well, screw you guys. If you don't appreciate what I did, then I'm not going to stand for this world any longer. Instead, I'm going to try and end it along with the Void. But I think it would be an interesting thought process to have a character like Kai'Sa or a character like Taliyah essentially appeal to his better half to say, look, yeah, you were once an Ascended warrior, and you still could be. Come with us and help protect us and help fight the Void with us, right? That would be a really interesting arc, I think, for Aatrox, and especially for a character like Aatrox, who hasn't really done all that much. We kind of have an idea of what he's been up to, which is basically walking around killing everything and everyone. We obviously know that he was heavily involved in Pantheon's story arc, but we don't know anything else besides that, and I think it would be really interesting to actually have him do something in a major storyline, and especially if he's sort of, maybe not a good guy, but also sort of the best person we have for the job at hand, right? I think that would be kind of an interesting arc to have. So I would love to see if Aatrox can actually show up in this story and participate in some regard. Rost, I feel like, probably won't, because that would imply that the Rost story arc has sort of been concluded, and Riot are never going to do that for obvious reasons, because they don't want to kill off either one of these characters, and necessarily, if one of them wins, the other loses and dies. So they will probably never see the conclusion of that storyline. And Varys, meanwhile, we just don't know enough about him. I would love for more development to be given for Varys. He could be another sort of Darken that's summoned to help protect them from the threat of the Void, but we'll have to kind of see. We also can't forget about Malphite. Malphite was the Shard of the Monolith, which was a ginormous construction created by one of the Ascended to fight against the Void. It was ultimately shattered, and Malphite is the one remaining shard of it. But Malphite, then theoretically, was created specifically to fight against the Void, so he's yet another character that could make an appearance in any sort of Void story arc. Taliyah apparently knows of him from Legends of Runeterra, so if Taliyah knows about Malphite, and she knows about Kai'Sa, right, there's sort of this connection here where you could theoretically see Kai'Sa basically saying, hey, Malphite, can you come with us to fight against Bel'Veth? There's also Jax. Jax is heavily implied to be one of the original Acathian host members who was sort of corrupted by the Void and who's now looking for powerful fighters to help him fight back against them. Jax, I think, is a character that absolutely needs to be included in any Void story arc because of how crucial I think it would be for Jax to show up and sort of say, hey, this is vengeance for Acacia. Speaking of Acacia, Zilean, I think, is the best answer for the Void story arc as a whole, right? If Bel'Veth is eventually defeated, obviously it doesn't stop the Void portal from having access to Runeterra, but it would be Zilean who would be able to potentially reverse the damage done to Runeterra, to reverse the ritual that the Acathian mages performed to open the world to the Void in the first place, and potentially then seal it back off from Runeterra as a whole, which is also what the Void want. The Void does not want to be attached to Runeterra either. So in that regard, Zilean, I think, needs to be factored in somehow. Obviously, he may not be a character specifically for this situation with Kai'Sa, because as I said, I feel like Zilean's inclusion in any sort of Void story arc would be at the end of it, Zilean being the one to save Acacia, to save the world. But I do think at the very least it would be nice to at least have a reference to the fact that yes, Zillion is around and is working against the Void alongside everybody else. I also know a lot of people are going to put it out here. There is some thought to having the Freljord characters involved in a Void story arc, because the Watchers are canonically frozen up in the Freljord. That's the sort of entire deal behind Lysandra, right, is she's trying to keep them frozen, because once they wake up, they're just going to obliterate Runeterra. And Bel'Veth kind of implies this as well, that if the Watchers were to wake, there's nothing she could even do to stop them. They're just going to kill everyone and everything, because they are the sort of old gods of the setting. But that said, I feel like because the Watchers are sort of the big underlying threat behind everything in the Freljord, right? Like they are the thing in the Freljord that's sort of the main source of conflict. In fact, that's the whole reason why Lysandra was at odds with her fellow sisters, was because specifically they were at odds with each other, right? She woke up to the Watchers, she said, hey, I'm going to do stuff for you, Watchers, but also she's going to try and freeze them. She's trying to play both sides of the equation, but that ultimately led to some of the problems that they ended up having and the conflict that she ended up in with her sisters. So in that regard, I don't feel like the Watchers will be fully addressed as a part of this specific storyline with Kai'Sa and Bel'Veth. They're very far away geographically, but also I feel like the sort of story arc here isn't that Kai'Sa will be involved with it, but that the Freljord characters will have to deal with it to sort of address their own story. So I don't feel like they'll get involved, but they theoretically could. I think it would at least be nice to have some sort of indication. Riot also could be willing to go for another globe-spanning storyline and basically say, hey, Kai'Sa's going to travel to the Freljord because that's where the Watchers are, and maybe she has a way to deal with them there, or goes to the Freljord to try and persuade the Freljordian gods that maybe they can fight and kill the Watchers. Not sure about that quite yet, but I do think it would be sort of an interesting way to approach things. But anyways, those are just sort of my thoughts on how I think the sort of Void story arc could go. I think there's a lot of potential here for Riot, and I really hope that if they do start a sort of big Void story before too long, that they really carefully consider what it is that they're actually doing with it. Now, one of the things I have with this Void story arc is that I do feel like it may not potentially be anytime soon. We have had, for example, Renata Glask introduced as sort of the main villain from Zaun, and obviously Riot haven't done anything with that quite yet, so they may just be setting stuff up for a distant future, right? At some point we'll do this, and this is the major character that you guys need to be worried about, right? That might be what Riot's approach to it, but either way, we'll have to see how it goes. I do think it's very likely that we have a Void story at some point, and these are just my thoughts. You guys will have to know what you think of the sort of Void story, what other characters or story arcs that you guys would like to see introduced in it. Hopefully we can get a bit of a discussion going here and give Riot maybe some ideas about what they should absolutely include with the Void story arc. Let me know all of that down in the comment section below. If you enjoyed the video today, go ahead and leave it a like. And if you really enjoyed the video, consider subscribing. I upload a video every Monday, Friday, and on patch days as well. Once again, thank you guys so very much for watching. I do appreciate it. And I'll talk to you all later.